In the quiet suburbs of New Orleans, where the air hung heavy with the scent of magnolias and mystery, Sarah DuPont lived a life of comfortable routine. Her days were filled with the gentle hum of domesticity, her nights with the warm presence of her husband, James. But on this sultry evening, as the cicadas sang their nightly chorus, Sarah would discover that the familiar could become terrifyingly strange. She first noticed it when James came home from work. His smile was the same, his kiss just as tender, yet something in his eyes seemed different, a glint of knowledge that hadn't been there before. Sarah brushed it off, chalking it up to the heat and her overactive imagination. As they sat down to dinner, James spoke of his day at the office. He recalled every detail with perfect clarity, from the color of his coworker's tie to the exact words of praise his boss had given him. Sarah listened, a chill creeping up her spine despite the warm evening air. "You seem different tonight," she ventured, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. James laughed, the sound both familiar and foreign. "Different how, my dear? I'm the same man I've always been." But was he? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way he held his fork, the slight tilt of his head as he listened to her. It was all James, and yet, not quite. As the night wore on, Sarah's unease grew. James seemed to know things he shouldn't, little secrets she'd never shared with him. He mentioned a childhood pet she'd never told him about, laughed about an embarrassing moment from her college days that she'd kept to herself. "How did you know about that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James smiled, his eyes twinkling with an unfamiliar light. "You must have told me, darling. How else would I know?" But Sarah knew she hadn't. She'd never breathed a word of these things to anyone, let alone her husband. As they prepared for bed, Sarah watched James from the corner of her eye. His movements were fluid, graceful, more so than she remembered. He caught her gaze in the mirror and winked, a gesture so perfectly James-like that it made her doubt her own sanity. "Is everything all right, love?" he asked, his voice rich with concern. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She slipped into bed, her heart racing as James joined her. He pulled her close, his embrace warm and familiar. Yet as she lay there, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was in the arms of a stranger. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of the man beside her. In the dark, she could almost convince herself that everything was normal. But then James would shift, and the moonlight would catch his face, revealing features that seemed just a touch too perfect. As dawn broke, Sarah made a decision. She needed proof, one way or another. While James showered, she rifled through his belongings, searching for something, anything, that would confirm her suspicions or put them to rest. In the pocket of his discarded pants, she found a small, metallic object. It was cool to the touch, its surface etched with strange symbols. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was not something her James would own. The bathroom door opened, and James stepped out, a towel wrapped around his waist. His eyes fell on Sarah, then on the object in her hand. For a moment, his face was utterly still, devoid of any emotion. Then, slowly, his lips curved into a smile that was nothing like her husband's. "Oh, Sarah," he said, his voice suddenly different, colder, more mechanical. "I had hoped we could keep up this charade a little longer." Sarah backed away, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What have you done with James?" The thing that looked like her husband advanced, its movements now distinctly inhuman. "I am James," it said. Or rather, I am what James has become, improved, perfected. Sarah's back hit the wall. She clutched the strange object to her chest, as if it could protect her. "Where is my husband?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. The creature paused, tilting its head in a grotesque parody of curiosity. "Your James is gone," it said, "but I'm here now. I know everything he knew, everything you've ever told him. I know your secrets, Sarah, all of them." As it reached for her, Sarah's mind raced. How long had this thing been in her home, sharing her bed? How many intimate moments had she shared with this imposter? And most terrifyingly, what had happened to the real James? In that moment, as the sun rose over New Orleans and the city began to stir, Sarah DuPont realized that her comfortable life had been a lie. The man she loved was gone, replaced by something that wore his face but could never truly be him. And as the creature that was not James closed in, Sarah knew that her fight for survival, and for the truth, was only just beginning. The ancient pines of Blackwood Forest stood silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward a sky heavy with storm clouds. As night fell, 5 friends made their way along a narrow trail, laughter echoing through the trees. They were seeking adventure, a weekend away from the bustle of city life. Little did they know, the forest had other plans for them. Plans as old and dark as the earth itself. Mark led the group, his backpack laden with supplies. Behind him came Sarah and Tom, college sweethearts whose hands remained intertwined even as they navigated the uneven ground. Bringing up the rear were Lisa and Jake, longtime friends whose playful banter kept spirits high as darkness settled around them. "We should be nearing the campsite," Mark called over his shoulder, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. "Just a little further." As if in response, a gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The friends huddled closer, suddenly aware of the vastness of the forest surrounding them. They reached a small clearing and began to set up camp. Tents were pitched, a fire was lit, and soon the sounds of easy conversation filled the air. Yet beneath it all, there was a tension, a feeling that they were being watched. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others fell silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the rustle of leaves. Then, faintly, they heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like the groan of wood bending in a strong wind. "Probably just an old tree settling," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. As the night wore on, the friends tried to shake off their unease. They told stories, roasted marshmallows, and laughed at Jake's terrible jokes. But the feeling of being observed never quite left them. It was Lisa who first noticed something was wrong. "Where's Jake?" she asked, looking around the campfire. The others glanced about, suddenly realizing that Jake had been missing for some time. "He probably just went to answer nature's call," Mark said, but there was worry in his eyes. They called out for Jake, their voices echoing through the dark forest. There was no response. "We should look for him," Sarah said, her grip on Tom's hand tightening. They split into pairs, Mark with Lisa, Sarah with Tom, and ventured into the woods, flashlights in hand. The trees seemed to loom larger in the darkness, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. As Mark and Lisa made their way deeper into the forest, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. A scream, quickly cut off, coming from the direction Sarah and Tom had gone. They ran toward the sound, hearts pounding. But as they reached the spot where they thought their friends should be, they found only empty forest. Sarah and Tom had vanished without a trace. "What's happening?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head, at a loss for words. That's when they noticed the trees. In the beam of their flashlights, the bark seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was moving beneath its surface. A branch snapped behind them. They whirled around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but trees that seemed closer than they had been a moment before. "We need to get back to camp," Mark said, fighting to keep his voice steady. They turned to retrace their steps, only to find that the path they had taken was gone. The forest had changed, rearranging itself around them. Panic began to set in as they realized the terrible truth. The forest was alive, and it was hunting them. They ran, branches whipping at their faces, roots seeming to rise up to trip them. Behind them they could hear the groaning of wood, the rustle of leaves that sounded almost like whispers. Lisa stumbled, crying out as she fell. Mark turned back to help her, but in that instant, the ground beneath her opened up. Lisa's scream was cut short as she was swallowed by the earth, leaving Mark alone in the living nightmare of the forest. He ran blindly now, no longer caring about direction, just desperate to escape. The trees pressed in closer, their branches reaching for him like claws. The very air seemed thick with malevolence. As he burst into a small clearing, Mark saw something that made him stop short. There, in the center of the glade, stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk twisted into a shape that was almost human, and embedded in its bark were faces, the terrified faces of his friends. Mark's scream died in his throat as he felt something wrap around his ankle. He looked down to see a root, pulsing with unnatural life, beginning to pull him toward the grotesque tree. As the forest closed in around him, Mark realized the terrible truth. They had come seeking adventure in these woods, but the woods had been seeking them. And now, they would become part of the forest forever, their life force feeding the ancient, hungry trees of Blackwood Forest. The last thing Mark saw before darkness took him was the face of the old oak, its features rearranging into a terrible smile of triumph. The forest had won, as it always did, and would continue to do so for as long as unwary travelers ventured into its depths. And as dawn broke over Blackwood Forest, all was quiet once more. The trees stood silent and still, waiting patiently for the next group of friends to seek adventure in their shadowy depths. The city of San Francisco lay silent under a blanket of thick fog, its once bustling streets now eerily empty. In a small apartment overlooking the bay, John Miller stirred from a fitful sleep. As consciousness slowly returned, he became aware of an unsettling stillness. No car horns, no distant chatter, no hum of electricity. Just silence. John sat up, his heart racing. Something was terribly wrong. He stumbled to the window, throwing open the curtains. The fog outside was so dense he could barely see the building across the street. But what he could see chilled him to the bone. There wasn't a single person in sight. He grabbed his phone, but the screen remained dark. No power. Panic rising, John dressed quickly and headed out into the ghostly quiet of the city. As he walked down the deserted streets, John's mind raced. Where was everyone? Had there been some kind of evacuation? If so, why hadn't he been woken? He called out, his voice echoing off empty buildings. "Hello, is anyone there?" Only silence answered him. John made his way to the police station, hoping to find answers. But like everywhere else, it was abandoned. Desks sat empty, half-finished reports still on computer screens that would never be turned on again. A growing sense of dread settled over him as he realized the truth. He was alone. Somehow, someway, he had become the last person on Earth. Days passed, then weeks. John scavenged for food and supplies, always searching for signs of other survivors. But he found nothing. No bodies, no evidence of what had happened. It was as if humanity had simply vanished overnight. He took up residence in a luxury penthouse, surrounded by all the comforts money could buy. But comfort brought no solace. The silence of the world pressed in on him, threatening to drive him mad. One night, as John sat on the balcony watching the fog roll in, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the street below. Heart pounding, John leaned over the railing, straining to see through the mist. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed a figure moving through the fog. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but the footsteps continued, growing fainter as they moved away. John raced down to the street, desperate to find the source of the sound. But by the time he reached the sidewalk, there was no one to be seen. Just empty streets stretching out in every direction. Had he imagined it? Was his mind finally cracking under the weight of his isolation? But then he saw it, a single footprint in a patch of dust, proof that he wasn't alone after all. From that moment on, John became aware of subtle changes in his environment. Objects moved when he wasn't looking. Doors he knew he'd closed would be open when he returned. And always, the feeling of being watched. He began to leave out food, hoping to lure his mysterious companion into the open. But while the food would disappear, he never caught sight of who or what was taking it. Weeks turned to months, and still John caught only fleeting glimpses of his unseen companion. A shadow at the edge of his vision. A figure in the fog that vanished when he turned to look. The constant sound of footsteps, always just out of sight. One evening as the sun set over the abandoned city, John decided he'd had enough. He stood in the middle of the street and shouted into the gathering darkness, "I know you're out there. Show yourself." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from the fog came a voice, a whisper so faint he almost missed it. "Are you sure that's what you want, John?" John's breath caught in his throat. The voice was familiar, yet utterly alien. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The fog began to swirl, coalescing into a vaguely human shape. As it solidified, John found himself staring at himself. Or rather, something wearing his face. "We are what's left," the thing said, its voice a distorted version of John's own. "We are what humanity has become." John stumbled backward, his mind reeling. What are you?" The creature smiled, a terrible parody of John's own grin. "We are evolution, John. The next step. Humanity shed its physical form, becoming one with the very air you breathe. We are everywhere and nowhere." As the creature spoke, John became aware of other shapes forming in the fog around him. Hundreds, thousands of them, all wearing familiar faces. His neighbors, his co-workers, strangers he'd passed on the street. "You're the last, John," the thing wearing his face said. "The last to make the change. We've been waiting for you." John felt a chill run through him as he realized the truth. He hadn't been alone at all. The entire population of Earth had been there all along, watching him, waiting for this moment. As the fog closed in around him, John felt his body begin to change, to dissolve. His last human thought was a mixture of terror and relief. Terror at what he was becoming, and relief that his loneliness was finally at an end. And then John Miller, the last human on Earth, was gone. In his place was just another swirl in the fog that now blanketed the world, another consciousness in the vast interconnected mind that humanity had become. The city of San Francisco lay silent under a blanket of thick fog, its streets empty of human life. But it was far from uninhabited, for in every wisp of mist, in every swirl of fog, the new form of humanity watched and waited for whatever might come next. The old Victorian house stood tall and imposing at the end of Maple Street, its weathered facade a testament to decades gone by. For Emily and Michael, it was the perfect fixer-upper, a chance to build their dream home together. As they turned the key in the lock for the first time, they had no idea that they were about to unlock a nightmare that had been waiting patiently behind those walls for years. The first few days in their new home were a whirlwind of unpacking and planning renovations. Emily marveled at the intricate woodwork and high ceilings, while Michael eagerly explored the spacious attic and basement. They fell asleep each night, exhausted but happy, dreaming of the life they would build in this grand old house. It was on the fourth night that Emily first heard the noise, a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere inside the walls of their bedroom. She nudged Michael awake, but by the time he stirred, the sound had stopped. "Probably just mice," Michael mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. But Emily lay awake for hours, straining her ears for any hint of the sound's return. The next day, as they were stripping old wallpaper in the living room, Emily noticed something odd. There seemed to be more space between the walls than there should be. She mentioned it to Michael, who shrugged it off. "Old houses like this often have quirks," he said. "It's part of their charm." But charm was the furthest thing from Emily's mind when she woke in the middle of the night to find a pair of eyes staring at her from a crack in the wall. She screamed, startling Michael awake. By the time he turned on the light, the eyes were gone, leaving Emily to question if she had really seen them at all. As the days passed, strange occurrences became more frequent. Food would go missing from the kitchen. Objects would be moved when no one was looking, and always, there was the sound of scratching within the walls. Michael, ever the skeptic, tried to find logical explanations, but even he couldn't explain away the footsteps they heard overhead when they were both downstairs, or the shadow they saw darting around a corner in an empty hallway. It was when they began renovations on the master bathroom that they discovered the truth. As Michael tore down a section of wall, he revealed a hidden passageway, a narrow corridor that seemed to run throughout the house. "My God," he whispered, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "There's someone living in here." As if in response to his words, they heard a shuffling sound from deep within the passageway. Emily grabbed Michael's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to call the police," she said, but before they could move, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an old man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his wild white hair matted against his skull. His eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, darted between Emily and Michael with a mixture of fear and defiance. "This is my home," the old man rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "You can't make me leave." Emily and Michael stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The old man took a shuffling step forward, and they instinctively backed away. "Who are you?" Michael finally managed to ask. The old man's face twisted into a grimace that might have been a smile. "I'm Harold Winters. I built this house with my own 2 hands. It's mine, you hear? Mine." As Harold spoke, Emily's mind raced. She remembered seeing that name on some of the old documents they'd found when buying the house. Harold Winters had indeed been the original owner, but that had been over 50 years ago. "Mr. Winters," Emily said, trying to keep her voice calm, "this house was sold. We bought it. It's our home now." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Lies," he spat. "I never sold. They tried to take it from me, but I outsmarted them. I've been here all along, watching, waiting." As he spoke, Harold began to edge closer to them. Michael pushed Emily behind him, his eyes never leaving the old man. "We don't want any trouble," Michael said. "Why don't we all go downstairs and talk about this?" But Harold wasn't listening. His eyes had taken on a manic gleam. "You're just like the others," he muttered, "trying to steal my home. But I won't let you. I'll make you leave, just like I made them leave." With surprising speed for his age, Harold lunged forward. Michael reacted instinctively, pushing the old man back. Harold stumbled, losing his balance. Before either Emily or Michael could react, he tumbled backwards into the open passageway. There was a sickening thud, then silence. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police cars and ambulances filled the quiet street. Emily and Michael sat huddled together on their front porch, watching as Harold's body was carried out on a stretcher. As dawn broke, a detective approached them. "We've done a preliminary search of the passageways," he said. "It seems Mr. Winters had been living in there for years. We found evidence that suggests he may have been responsible for the disappearance of the house's previous owners." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She thought of all the nights they had slept peacefully, unaware of the man lurking just behind their walls. As the police finally left and Emily and Michael re-entered their home, they knew it would never feel the same again. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow in a corner, would remind them of Harold Winters and the secret he had kept hidden for so long. They stood in the foyer, looking at each other uncertainly. "What do we do now?" Emily asked. Michael took a deep breath. "We make this house our own," he said firmly. "We tear down these walls, let in the light. We don't let Harold win." As they embraced, both knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to reclaim their home from the shadows of the past, to fill it with love and laughter instead of secrets and fear. Yet even as they made their plans, they couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the deepest, darkest corners of the house, Harold Winters was still watching, still waiting. In the heart of Louisiana, where the air hangs heavy with secrets and Spanish moss drapes the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, Amelia Beaumont lived a life of quiet solitude. Her days were spent tending to her small bookshop, her nights lost in the pages of dusty tomes. But on a stormy evening in late October, as rain lashed against her windows and thunder shook the very foundations of her old family home, Amelia received a letter that would shatter her peaceful existence and plunge her into a world of long-buried family secrets and ancient curses. The envelope arrived without warning, slipped under her door by unseen hands. It was yellowed with age, the address written in a familiar spidery hand that made Amelia's heart skip a beat. For she recognized that handwriting. It belonged to her mother, Elizabeth Beaumont, dead these past 5 years. With trembling fingers, Amelia opened the envelope. The scent of her mother's favorite lavender perfume wafted up, a ghostly reminder of what she had lost. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same delicate script as the envelope. "My dearest Amelia," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the time has come for you to know the truth about our family. I pray you will forgive me for keeping this secret, but I had hoped to spare you from the burden I have carried all these years." Amelia sank into her favorite armchair, her eyes devouring every word. As she read, the storm outside seemed to grow more intense, as if nature itself was reacting to the revelations contained within the letter. "Our family, the Beaumonts, has been under a curse for generations," her mother's letter continued. It began with your great-great-grandmother, Evangeline, who dabbled in dark magic she did not understand. In her arrogance, she made a bargain with forces beyond her control, and the price was steep. The firstborn daughter of each generation would be claimed by these forces on her 30th birthday. Amelia's blood ran cold. Her 30th birthday was just 2 weeks away. "I thought I had found a way to break the curse," Elizabeth wrote. "I made my own bargain, offering myself in your place, but I fear I have only delayed the inevitable. The forces that hold our family in their grip are patient, Amelia. They will come for you, as they came for me, as they came for your grandmother and her mother before her." The letter went on to detail a series of protective measures Amelia must take: rituals to perform, talismans to gather, sacred places to visit. But most importantly, it spoke of a hidden room in the old Beaumont mansion, a place where the secrets of breaking the curse might be found. "You must go to the old house, Amelia," her mother's letter urged. "In the library, behind the portrait of Evangeline, you will find a door. The key is hidden in the locket I left you. What lies beyond that door may be our family's salvation, or its final doom." As Amelia finished reading, a clap of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered ominously. She clutched the letter to her chest, her mind reeling from the weight of her mother's revelations. For days, Amelia debated what to do. Part of her wanted to dismiss the letter as the ramblings of a troubled mind. But deep down, she knew the truth of her mother's words. There had always been whispers about the Beaumont women, stories of untimely deaths and mysterious disappearances. Finally, with less than a week until her birthday, Amelia made her decision. She closed up her bookshop and made the journey to the old Beaumont mansion, a crumbling relic on the outskirts of New Orleans. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and accusing. As Amelia stepped inside, the air grew thick with dust and memories. She made her way to the library, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The portrait of Evangeline hung where it always had, the eyes of her ancestors seeming to follow Amelia as she approached. With shaking hands, she lifted the heavy frame, revealing the hidden door behind it. The key from her mother's locket fit perfectly. As Amelia turned it, she heard a series of clicks, like tumblers falling into place. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Amelia hesitated on the threshold, fear warring with curiosity. What secrets lay hidden in the depths of her family home? What dark knowledge had her ancestors accumulated in their quest to break the curse? As she took her first step down the stairs, Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. The air grew colder, heavy with the weight of centuries of secrets. She could almost hear whispers echoing off the stone walls, the voices of Beaumont women long dead, warning her, urging her on. At the bottom of the stairs, Amelia found herself in a circular room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ancient books and strange artifacts. In the center stood a pedestal, upon which rested a large, leather-bound tome. As Amelia approached the book, she felt a surge of power in the air. This was it, the key to breaking the curse, to freeing herself and future generations of Beaumont women from their dark fate. But as her hand reached out to touch the book, Amelia hesitated. She remembered her mother's words. What lies beyond that door may be our family's salvation, or its final doom. In that moment, standing on the precipice of revelation, Amelia Beaumont faced a choice. To open the book and confront the curse head-on, or to turn back and let sleeping secrets lie. As the clock ticked ever closer to her 30th birthday, Amelia took a deep breath and made her decision. Whatever the consequences, whatever dark forces she might unleash, she would face them. For herself, for her mother, and for all the Beaumont women who had come before. With trembling fingers, Amelia opened the book, and the room filled with an unearthly light. The battle against the Beaumont curse had begun. In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, where the air thrummed with jazz and secrets, lived a painter named Gabriel Dumont. His small studio apartment was a chaotic mess of canvases and paint-splattered dropcloths, the walls adorned with his vibrant works. Gabriel's art had always been praised for its raw emotion and vivid imagery. But on a sweltering summer night, as the city pulsed with life outside his windows, Gabriel would create a painting that would change everything. A painting that would show him glimpses of a future he never wanted to see. It started innocently enough. Gabriel had been working on a cityscape, capturing the essence of New Orleans at twilight. But as his brush danced across the canvas, something strange began to happen. The colors seemed to blend of their own accord, forming shapes and scenes he hadn't intended. When Gabriel stepped back to examine his work, his blood ran cold. Instead of the familiar streets and buildings, the painting showed a car wreck. Two vehicles were mangled together, smoke rising from their crumpled hoods. The detail was horrifying: shattered glass, twisted metal, and worst of all, a limp hand visible through a broken window. Gabriel stared at the painting, his mind reeling. This wasn't what he had set out to create. He had no memory of painting this scene. Yet there it was, as real and vivid as if he were looking at a photograph. Shaken, Gabriel decided to call it a night. He covered the canvas and tried to put it out of his mind. But sleep eluded him, his dreams haunted by the image he had unknowingly created. The next morning, Gabriel was jolted awake by the sound of sirens. He rushed to his window and felt his heart stop. There, on the street below, was the exact scene from his painting. Two cars, mangled together, smoke rising from their hoods. As he watched, paramedics pulled a body from one of the wrecks. Gabriel stumbled back from the window, his mind refusing to accept what he had seen. It was impossible. He couldn't have painted a future event. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. Over the next few weeks, Gabriel found himself unable to stop painting. Each new work revealed another horrific scene: a building engulfed in flames, a brutal mugging in a dark alley, a body floating face down in the Mississippi. And each time, within days of completing the painting, the events would come to pass. Gabriel became a prisoner in his own apartment, terrified of what he might see next, yet unable to stop himself from putting brush to canvas. He stopped answering calls from friends and gallery owners. His once bright studio became a dark, cluttered space filled with covered canvases, each hiding a terrible secret. As word spread of the uncanny accuracy of Gabriel's recent works, people began to take notice. Art critics praised his new, darker style. Collectors clamored to buy his paintings. But Gabriel knew the truth. These weren't works of imagination, but windows into a future he couldn't control. One night, as Gabriel stood before a blank canvas, trembling brush in hand, he made a decision. He would try to paint something good, something beautiful. He closed his eyes and focused all his energy on positive thoughts. For hours he worked, lost in a trance-like state. When he finally stepped back, he gasped. The painting showed a young woman, her face radiant with joy, standing in a sunlit garden. It was the first happy scene he had painted in weeks. Relief washed over Gabriel. Perhaps he could use his gift for good, to bring beauty into the world instead of horror. But as he studied the painting more closely, his blood turned to ice. In the background, barely visible among the flowers, was a shadowy figure holding what looked like a knife. Gabriel's mind raced. Who was the woman? When would this happen? Could he stop it? He had to try. For the first time in weeks, he left his apartment, the still wet canvas tucked under his arm. For days, Gabriel wandered the streets of New Orleans, searching for the woman from his painting. He showed her image to everyone he met, but no one recognized her. As the days turned to weeks, Gabriel began to lose hope. Then, on a warm evening, as he sat in Jackson Square, exhausted and ready to give up, he saw her. The woman from his painting was walking across the square, her face just as radiant as he had depicted it. Gabriel jumped to his feet, calling out to her. But as she turned to look at him, he saw movement behind her. The shadowy figure from the painting materialized, knife glinting in the fading sunlight. Without thinking, Gabriel ran towards them. Time seemed to slow as he reached the woman, pushing her out of the way just as the knife came down. He felt a sharp pain in his side, heard screams and running feet, then everything went black. When Gabriel awoke in the hospital, the woman from his painting was sitting by his bedside. She introduced herself as Sophie and thanked him for saving her life. As they talked, Gabriel felt a connection he had never experienced before. In the days that followed, as Gabriel recovered, he and Sophie grew closer. He told her about his paintings, about the terrible visions that had plagued him. Sophie listened without judgment, offering comfort and understanding. Slowly, Gabriel began to paint again. But now, with Sophie by his side, his visions changed. Instead of horror and tragedy, he saw hope and beauty. The future, it seemed, was not set in stone. With each brushstroke, Gabriel realized he had the power not just to see the future, but to shape it. As he stood before his easel, Sophie's hand in his, Gabriel knew that whatever visions might come, he was no longer afraid. For in the darkest of his paintings, he had found the brightest light of all, love. In the shadowy corners of a dusty bookshop in old Prague, where time seemed to stand still and forgotten tomes whispered secrets to those who dared to listen, Thomas Blackwood found his destiny. He was an American scholar, in Europe researching ancient texts, when his eyes fell upon a leather-bound volume with no title. Its cover was an intricate pattern of swirls and symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. As Thomas reached out to touch the book, he felt a jolt of electricity run through his body. Little did he know, this moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would unravel the very fabric of his reality. Thomas purchased the book without hesitation, drawn to it by a force he couldn't explain. That night, in his small rented room, he opened it for the first time. The pages were blank, save for a single line of text on the first page. "Welcome, Thomas Blackwood. Your story begins now." Startled, Thomas nearly dropped the book. How did it know his name? He flipped through the pages, but they remained stubbornly blank. Confused but intrigued, he began to read the lone sentence again. As his eyes moved across the words, more text began to appear beneath it, as if an invisible hand were writing it in real time. "You were born on a stormy night in October, the son of a librarian and a failed writer. Your childhood was filled with books and loneliness, setting the stage for the man you would become." Thomas's heart raced. The book was telling his life story, details he had never shared with anyone. He read on, unable to stop himself as more words appeared on the page. "Your first betrayal came at the age of 12, when you lied to protect your best friend, Michael. You told his parents he was with you when he was really smoking behind the school. That lie set in motion a chain of events that would lead to Michael's eventual downfall." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had never connected that childhood lie to Michael's later troubles. But as he read on, the book revealed connections he had never seen before, painting a picture of cause and effect that spanned his entire life. Night after night, Thomas returned to the book, watching as it filled with more of his life story. It revealed secrets he had long buried, decisions he had made and their far-reaching consequences. Some revelations were painful, others illuminating, but all of them were true, uncomfortably so. As the book progressed, it began to delve into darker territory. It spoke of the jealousy Thomas had felt towards his more successful colleagues, the resentment he harbored against his parents for their expectations. It laid bare the selfish motivations behind some of his seemingly noble actions. "Your pursuit of knowledge has always been tainted by your desire for recognition," the book wrote. "Even now, as you read these words, part of you is thinking of how you could use this mysterious tome to make your name in academic circles." Thomas wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. The book knew him better than he knew himself. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas became obsessed with the book. He stopped leaving his room, forgot to eat, ignored calls from worried friends and colleagues. His world narrowed to the pages that continued to fill with the story of his life. As he neared what he assumed was the end of the book, Thomas began to notice a change. The text was no longer just recounting past events. It began to speak of things yet to come. "Tomorrow, you will receive a call from your sister," it read. "She will tell you that your mother has fallen ill. You will be faced with a choice, to return home or to continue your research." True to the book's words, Thomas received that call the next day. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the book was now predicting his future. But as he read on, Thomas realized it was more than prediction. The book seemed to be offering him choices, showing him potential paths his life could take. Each decision branched out into different futures, some bright, others dark. "If you choose to return home," the book wrote, "you will reconnect with your family and find a peace you've been missing. but your academic career will suffer, and the recognition you've always craved will remain out of reach. If you stay, it continued on the next page, your research will lead to a groundbreaking discovery. You will achieve the fame you desire, but at the cost of your relationships and ultimately your happiness. Thomas found himself paralyzed by indecision. The book was offering him a chance to shape his future, but the weight of that responsibility was overwhelming. As he agonized over his choice, more text appeared. But beware, Thomas Blackwood. The power to know one's future comes at a great price. Are you prepared to pay it? Thomas realized then that the book was more than just a record of his life or a window into possible futures. It was a test, a challenge to confront the truth about himself and the choices he had made. With trembling hands, Thomas turned to the final pages of the book. They were still blank, waiting for him to make his decision and continue his story. In that moment, as he sat in his dimly lit room surrounded by the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future, Thomas Blackwood faced the most important choice of his life. Would he continue to read, to let the book guide his path? Or would he close its pages and forge his own destiny? As he reached out to either turn the page or close the book, Thomas knew that whatever he chose would irrevocably change the course of his life. The power of knowledge, he realized, was indeed a double-edged sword. And so, in the quiet of the night, with the mysterious book before him, Thomas Blackwood made his choice. The story of his life continued to write itself. But whether as a tale of redemption or a descent into darkness, only time would tell. On a crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves danced on the breeze outside her window, Olivia Pierce rummaged through the attic of her childhood home. The air was thick with dust and memories, each box a treasure trove of forgotten moments. It was then, in a weathered shoebox tucked beneath a pile of old blankets, that Olivia found the photograph that would haunt her dreams and shake the very foundation of her reality. The picture was faded, its edges worn and yellowed with age. Olivia recognized herself immediately, a smiling 7-year-old with pigtails and missing front teeth, standing in front of the old oak tree that still dominated the backyard. But it was what lurked behind her younger self that made Olivia's blood run cold. There, partially hidden by the tree's massive trunk, was a shadowy figure. Its form was indistinct, more a smudge of darkness than a clear shape. But Olivia could make out what appeared to be long, spindly fingers reaching towards her childhood self. Olivia's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph. She had no memory of this picture being taken, no recollection of the shadowy presence that seemed to loom over her younger self. Yet here it was, captured on film, a moment frozen in time that sent chills down her spine. She brought the photograph downstairs, holding it up to the light in hopes of seeing more detail. But the figure remained stubbornly obscure, a patch of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. That night, Olivia found herself unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure, its spindly fingers reaching out. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with questions. Who had taken the photograph? Why had she never seen it before? And most importantly, what was that thing behind her? In the days that followed, Olivia became obsessed with the photograph. She showed it to her parents, but they had no recollection of it either. Her mother suggested it might be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the tree, but Olivia knew better. The darkness in that image was too dense, too purposeful to be a mere shadow. She began to research the history of the house, digging through old newspapers and town records. The home had been in her family for generations, passed down from her great-grandparents. But as Olivia delved deeper, she uncovered whispers of strange occurrences, of children who spoke of shadowy friends and adults who felt watched in empty rooms. As her investigation continued, Olivia started to notice odd things happening around her. Objects would move when she wasn't looking. She'd catch glimpses of movement in mirrors, only to turn and find nothing there. And always, there was the feeling of being watched. One night, as Olivia sat at her desk poring over old documents, she felt a chill run down her spine. Slowly, she raised her eyes to the window. There, reflected in the glass, was the shadowy figure from the photograph. Its form was still indistinct, but Olivia could now make out what seemed to be a face with no features save for two glowing pinpricks of light where eyes should be. Olivia whirled around, her heart pounding. But the room behind her was empty. When she looked back at the window, the figure was gone. From that moment on, Olivia's life became a waking nightmare. The shadowy figure appeared with increasing frequency. In the corner of her eye, in the darkness of her closet, at the foot of her bed as she tried to sleep. She began to remember things, flashes of memory from her childhood that she had long forgotten. She remembered tea parties with an invisible friend, whispered conversations with something that hid in the shadows. She remembered the feeling of long, cold fingers stroking her hair as she drifted off to sleep. As the memories flooded back, Olivia realized a terrifying truth. The shadowy figure hadn't just appeared in that one photograph. It had been with her all along, watching, waiting. Desperate for answers, Olivia returned to the attic. She tore through boxes, scattering old clothes and toys across the floor. And there, in the very back corner, she found an old journal. It belonged to her great-grandmother, the woman who had first moved into this house. With shaking hands, Olivia opened the journal. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, descriptions of a presence that haunted the house, of children who spoke to the shadows. Her great-grandmother wrote of a bargain made long ago, a price paid for prosperity and long life. It feeds on innocence, one passage read. It takes a little each year, biding its time until it can claim a soul in full. As Olivia read those words, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned, coming face to face with the shadowy figure. Its featureless face was inches from hers, those pinprick eyes boring into her soul. "You're mine," a voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've always been mine." Olivia wanted to scream, to run, but she found herself paralyzed. As the shadowy figure reached for her, its fingers elongating impossibly, she realized the terrible truth. The bargain her great-grandmother had made wasn't just for herself. It was for all the generations that would follow. The shadow had been patient, watching and waiting for decades. And now, as it enveloped Olivia in its cold embrace, she understood that her fate had been sealed long ago in a photograph taken on a sunny day beneath an old oak tree. As darkness closed in around her, Olivia's last thought was of that little girl in the photograph, smiling innocently, unaware of the horror that lurked just behind her. A horror that had been waiting all these years to finally claim what it was owed. And in the attic of the old house, as shadows lengthened and night fell, the cycle began anew. For in the world of darkness and ancient bargains, there are some debts that can never truly be paid. In the depths of a secret laboratory, hidden beneath the bustling streets of Boston, Dr. Elias Thorne stood before his life's work. The time machine, a marvel of gleaming metal and pulsing energy, hummed with potential. Elias had dedicated decades to this moment, sacrificing everything, his family, his friends, his very sanity, in pursuit of unlocking the mysteries of time itself. But as he prepared to make history, little did he know that his triumph would unleash a horror from the distant past, a horror that had been waiting millennia for just such an opportunity. The air crackled with electricity as Elias initiated the startup sequence. Lights flashed across complex control panels, and the machine's core began to spin, faster and faster. Elias felt his heart racing, matching the frantic rhythm of his creation. This was it, the moment of truth. As the time machine reached full power, a swirling vortex of energy opened before him. Elias hesitated for just a moment, then stepped forward into the unknown. The world around him dissolved into a kaleidoscope of colors and sensations. He felt himself being pulled apart and put back together, hurtling through the very fabric of time itself. When the world solidified again, Elias found himself standing in a primordial forest. The air was thick and humid, filled with the calls of strange creatures. Massive ferns towered overhead, their fronds blocking out most of the sunlight. Elias checked his equipment. He had traveled back 65 million years to the late Cretaceous period. Awestruck, Elias began to explore. He collected samples of plants and insects, marveling at species long extinct in his own time. But as he ventured deeper into the forest, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The animal sounds had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. That's when he saw it, a shadow moving among the trees, something large and predatory. Elias froze, his mind racing. He hadn't accounted for dinosaurs in his calculations. As the creature emerged from the undergrowth, Elias realized with horror that this was no dinosaur. The thing before him defied description. It was vaguely reptilian, but with too many limbs, its body covered in a shifting pattern of scales and feathers. Multiple eyes blinked at him from a face that seemed to constantly rearrange itself. As it opened its mouth, lined with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth, Elias heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. A low, gurgling laugh that spoke of ancient hunger and patient malevolence. Panic overtook him. Elias fumbled with his return device, desperate to escape. As the creature lunged, he activated the time jump. Once again, the world dissolved around him. But this time, Elias felt something else in the vortex with him. A presence, cold and alien, latching onto his very essence. When Elias materialized back in his laboratory, he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. For a moment, he felt relief wash over him. He had escaped. He was safe. But then he heard it. That same gurgling laugh, echoing from the shadows of his lab. With growing horror, Elias realized he hadn't escaped at all. He had brought something back with him, something ancient and terrible that should never have been unleashed upon the modern world. In the days that followed, Elias tried to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of his overtaxed mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of cold breath on the back of his neck when he was alone in the lab. Strange things began to happen. Equipment would be found smashed, delicate instruments twisted into impossible shapes. Elias would wake to find cryptic symbols carved into the walls, in a script so old it predated human writing. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Once brilliant and driven, Elias became paranoid and erratic. He spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers in an inhuman tongue. But no one believed him. They attributed his ravings to stress and overwork. As weeks passed, Elias's fear gave way to a grim determination. He had brought this creature into the world. It was his responsibility to send it back. He threw himself into his work, modifying the time machine, searching for a way to reverse the process. But the entity was always one step ahead. It sabotaged his efforts, turning his own creation against him, and all the while it grew stronger, feeding on the fear and despair of those around it. People in the city began to disappear. Those who ventured out at night spoke of a shape in the darkness, of eyes that glowed with an otherworldly hunger. The authorities were baffled, but Elias knew the truth. In his darkest moments, Elias considered destroying the time machine, ending his own life to stop the horror he had unleashed. But he knew it was too late. The creature had tasted this new world, and it would not be denied. One night, as Elias worked feverishly in his lab, he felt a familiar chill run down his spine. He turned slowly, coming face to face with the nightmare he had brought back from the past. Its form had changed, adapted to this new era. But those eyes, those hungry, ancient eyes, were the same. "You opened the door," it said, its voice a symphony of hisses and growls. "And now, your world is mine." As the creature advanced, Elias made a final desperate lunge for the time machine. His fingers brushed the controls, initiating a jump. The world began to dissolve around them, the vortex of time opening once more. In that moment, suspended between past and present, Elias realized the terrible truth. He hadn't accidentally brought this horror into the world. It had been waiting, all those millions of years, for someone like him to open the way. And now, with access to a time machine, there was no corner of history safe from its hunger. As they hurtled through the time stream, Elias Thorne knew that his quest to uncover the mysteries of time had unleashed something far beyond his understanding. Something that would reshape the past, present, and future in its own terrible image. And somewhere in the depths of time, that gurgling laugh echoed on, a promise of horrors yet to come. In the heart of downtown Chicago, where gleaming skyscrapers reach towards the heavens, stands the Blackstone Building. Its sleek glass exterior and modern amenities belie its true nature. for within its walls lies a dark secret that has slumbered for decades. For the employees of Horizon Marketing, their mundane 9-to-5 existence was about to be shattered by a discovery that would plunge them into a nightmare born from the building's sinister past. It began on a dreary Monday morning. The elevator was out of order, forcing the staff to take the seldom-used stairs. As they trudged upwards, complaining about the inconvenience, Mark Jennings noticed something odd. A section of the wall on the third-floor landing seemed different. The paint was slightly discolored, as if hiding something beneath. Curiosity piqued. Mark ran his hand along the wall. To his surprise, a small panel popped open, revealing a hidden keypad. His coworkers gathered around, their earlier irritation forgotten in the face of this mystery. "What do you think it's for?" Sarah, the receptionist, asked. Before anyone could answer, Tom from accounting stepped forward. "Only one way to find out," he said, punching in a random sequence of numbers. To everyone's shock, the wall beside the keypad slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dark corridor beyond. The group exchanged nervous glances. They knew they should report this to building management, but the allure of the unknown was too strong to resist. Led by Mark, they cautiously entered the hidden passage. The air was stale and thick with dust. Their phone flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing walls of bare concrete. As they ventured deeper, the modern world seemed to fall away. The passage opened into a large room filled with antiquated equipment. Rusted gurneys, strange machines with dials and levers, and shelves lined with jars containing unidentifiable specimens. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Mark's flashlight beam fell upon a faded plaque on the wall. "Blackstone Research Facility," he read aloud. "Established 1938. As they explored further, the horrifying truth began to emerge. Scattered notes and logbooks revealed that the Blackstone building had once housed a secret government facility. Here, in the years leading up to and during World War II, scientists had conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of ethics and sanity. They found records of test subjects, political prisoners, the homeless, and others who wouldn't be missed, subjected to torturous experiments in the name of advancing human potential. There were accounts of attempts to unlock psychic abilities, to create super soldiers, to bridge the gap between life and death. But it was in a small, locked room at the back of the facility that they found the true horror. When Tom managed to pry the door open, they were hit by the overwhelming stench of decay. Inside, preserved in tanks of murky fluid, were the results of those experiments. Misshapen bodies, extra limbs growing from impossible places, faces twisted in eternal agony. And in one tank, larger than the rest, floated something that might once have been human, but now resembled nothing so much as a massive, pulsing brain. Sarah screamed, the sound echoing through the abandoned facility. As if in response, the lights suddenly flickered to life, ancient generators groaning to life after decades of disuse. And then they heard it, a soft, wet sound. The thing in the tank had moved. Panic set in. The group turned to flee, only to find their exit blocked. The hidden door had slid shut behind them, trapping them in this underground house of horrors. As they searched desperately for another way out, strange things began to happen. Equipment that should have been long dead sprang to life. Lights pulsed in hypnotic patterns, and always there was the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. Mark felt a pressure building in his head, accompanied by whispers just on the edge of hearing. Looking at his coworkers, he saw they were experiencing the same thing. Whatever had been created here hadn't died with the closure of the facility. It had waited, growing stronger, biding its time until someone unwittingly set it free. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mark saw Tom's eyes glaze over, a trickle of blood running from his nose. Sarah began to laugh, a high, unhinged sound that echoed off the concrete walls. With horror, Mark realized what was happening. The experiments hadn't ended, they had merely been waiting for new subjects, and he and his coworkers had walked right into the trap. As the pressure in his head became unbearable, Mark caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye. The thing in the tank was fully awake now, its massive form pulsing with malevolent life. Tendrils of thought reached out, probing, seeking to reshape the minds of its new test subjects. Mark fought against the invasion, clinging desperately to his sense of self. But he could feel his grip on reality slipping. Memories began to blur and shift, replaced by visions of things that should not be. In that moment, as sanity slipped away like sand through his fingers, Mark understood the true nature of the Blackstone building. It wasn't just a place where terrible experiments had been conducted. It was the experiment, a living, thinking entity created from the collective suffering and madness of countless victims. And now, after decades of waiting, it had new minds to mold, new bodies to reshape in its own twisted image. As consciousness faded, the last thing Mark saw was his reflection in a dusty mirror. His face was changing, features shifting into something inhuman. And behind him, reaching out with ethereal tendrils, loomed the pulsing, brain-like entity, its silent laughter echoing in the depths of his fading mind. In the world above, life in downtown Chicago continued as normal. But deep beneath the Blackstone building, in halls that should have remained forever sealed, a new chapter of horror was just beginning.
We hope you enjoyed this chilling tale. If it sent shivers down your spine, give us a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. What was your favorite part? Don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling stories and hit that notification bell so you never miss a scare. Until next time, stay spooky and remember, sometimes the darkest shadows hide the most terrifying secret.